Well, hey, today we are continuing and finishing up a series called Troublemakers. It's all about this guy named Paul. We've been looking at this guy named Paul who has been going around the known world in the ancient world, and he's going with his companions, his compadres, his co-patriots, people who believe like he does, people who, many of them he has brought to the faith. He's been going from city to city, town to town, village to village, and he's been spreading this news about a guy named Jesus, which was pretty far-fetched. I mean, pretty far-fetched if you want to be honest about it. I mean, think about it. What he was saying was so different than anything that anybody else was saying at the time. They knew about gods and goddesses all over the empire, and his people, Paul's people, the Jews, only really said there was one God over all, and they knew about all that, but what he was saying was something different, that this one God had sent his one and only Son, and that this one and only Son was Jesus, and that Jesus had lived this life on earth, and it was somehow truly human and truly God at the same time, and that even though he was sinless and perfect and never did anything wrong, people had grabbed him and said, like, you're the problem here, you're a troublemaker, and they crucified him. But the thing was, because Jesus was the one and only Son of God, and because Jesus was sinless and perfect and all things good, that he couldn't stay dead, that God raised him from the dead. This was totally foreign to so many of the people that Paul was talking to. Such a foreign idea to all the people that Paul is talking to. And so as Paul is going with his companions, his compadres, his co-patriots, from town to town and village to village, doing all of these things and saying all of this stuff about Jesus, he was looked at as a troublemaker too. He was looked at as somebody causing all kinds of problems. Sometimes, when you're going around and you're spreading this good news about Jesus, you're going to be seen as a troublemaker. In fact, in a world that's rapidly moving away from Christianity, in a society that's rapidly moving away from a worldview that's Jesus-centric, I would suggest, I would submit that if we're really and truly following Jesus, that we are necessarily going to find ourselves causing a little bit of trouble in the world around us, that we will butt heads with somebody who doesn't believe in Jesus at some point. Not because we're bad people, not because they're bad people, but because we have different ideas about things, different value systems, different worldviews about how the entire universe is set up and operating. It's only natural that you're going to have some level of trouble come with that. And so, on the one hand, being a troublemaker, is kind of necessary. On the other, the thing about being a troublemaker is it isn't always fun, and it isn't always helpful, and it doesn't always go well. I mean, history is littered with characters and figures that you could think of who have been the disruptors, the ones who were a disruptive force somewhere, the ones who, well, they were just troublemakers. You think about people like Martin Luther King Jr. in the 60s and how that ended for him, assassinated outside of a Memphis hotel room. You think 100 years before that, a guy named Abraham Lincoln, also assassinated in a theater. You think 100 years before that with the American Revolution, people who were fighting for freedom, passing away, dying in wars. You could go on and on and on throughout history. People you've never heard of, people you have heard of, who have been troublemakers, who have been disruptors. didn't always go so well. But you could also find some examples of things going really well. You know, sometimes life doesn't go well at all, but sometimes it goes incredibly well. Sometimes it goes incredibly well. You ever have a moment in your life, a period of your life where it's like everything is great, everything is just going perfectly? You can't even explain it, but it's like everything is just fantastic. Like there's a part, like you're familiar with the part of life where things don't go so well, and it's like, man, everything is going wrong. And we focus in on that. We think like that's just how life is, and life's never good. And we get so used to the negative and to the bad, to the unhelpful, that there's a time in our life where things go perfectly, where things are going really, really well. And we're so unused to things going really well that we don't know what to do about it. We're so unused to things going really, really well that we don't know what to do about it. And we struggle through how exactly we're supposed to deal when things go really well. Like, what do? When everything in your life is going perfectly, everything in your life is going wonderfully, how do you react? How do people react to you when things are going really well? For instance, what if you won the lottery? I'm not advocating that you play the lottery, by the way. I'm not advocating that you won. All I'm going to say about that is if you decide you're going to put $5 or $10 down on a Mega Millions jackpot or something like that, that maybe you should tithe that to the church or something, right? You win $1.6 billion, I mean, God needs a cut too, all right? I'm not advocating that you necessarily play the lottery or anything like that, but if you did play the lottery, and if you did win the Mega Millions jackpot of $1.6 billion, you would walk away with about $800 million. What are you going to do with $800 million? And how do you think people are going to interact and engage with you after that? Like, what would you spend it on? I wonder. Like, if they just handed you, like, a seedy briefcase with $800 million and they go, here you go, pal. Like, what are you going to do? It'd be interesting, wouldn't it? It'd be interesting. But what would be more interesting is the way that people would interact with you. You ever read up on lottery winners? Like the ones who win like 1.6 whatever dollars, right? Like millions of dollars. It's not great. It's not a great history. Most of them lose all their money in the end and have very, very strained, if not terminated, relationships with their friends and family that they've always known. Life can go really well, and it can go really poorly. The question for some of us is, what do we do when life goes really well? Because some of us, we don't know how to handle success. Because sometimes life does go really well. We've been talking about Paul, for instance. And Paul was going from town to town and village to village, city to city, talking about Jesus, spreading the good news about Jesus. And he was seen as a troublemaker because he's talking about Jesus. And so when he's in Thessalonica, things are kind of going well, and then everybody turns on him, and there's a riot, and they riot to get him out of town. He has to leave under cover of darkness to get out of Thessalonica. He goes to Berea. The people from Thessalonica, they come to Berea to make him leave. They riot there and get him out of that town. Then he goes to Athens, and in Athens, he has a confrontational moment there. He ends up leaving there as well. Then he goes to Corinth. He gets into Corinth. Things are going pretty well there, but he is part of like this kind of emotional church split type thing that happens. He's afraid people are going to run him out of there. Eventually, they drag him in front of a proconsul, which had to be terrifying in its own way. Now he's gone on to a place called Ephesus. He gets to Ephesus, and something is different about Ephesus. Like everything had been going bad, right? It starts great, and then suddenly it goes really poorly. And I'm sure he was always waiting for the other shoe to drop. But he gets to Ephesus, and things start going incredibly well. I mean, people are being healed. There's like demons being cast out of people. There's all sorts of stuff like that. People are listening to what he says. He starts off at the synagogue like normal, and he has 3 months there where he's convincing people, and things are going great. And then they say, hey, that's enough. We don't want to hear from you anymore. And Paul says, all right, I'm going on to my next place. And he goes and he finds this little lecture hall. And he starts speaking in this lecture hall. And the best we can tell is he speaks in this lecture hall and he does things in this lecture hall from about 11 in the morning to about 4 in the afternoon. Well, we do 11 to 12 here at Church on the Drive, so I mean we could be going to 4. You're welcome. I'm glad you're here though. But let me clue you in on why that's such an important time, because that was the time period in that part of the world at that time in the world from 11 to 4. Nobody did anything. It was like a great siesta. It was so hot that nobody went out and did anything at that time. They refused. And so the people who were coming to the lecture hall to hear Paul talk about Jesus were genuinely curious and genuinely trying to follow Jesus and genuinely wanting to know what Paul had to say about these things. He had true believers walking around with him. That's incredible. That's an incredible thing. Other people might have just stayed home. You would think that with everything going on, that nobody would want to listen to Paul, but there are people coming out of the woodwork to listen to him. And so many people were giving their lives to Christ. So many people were saying, I'm following this King Jesus, that it was starting to disrupt things. Let me show you how good things were going. God did extraordinary miracles through Paul so that even handkerchiefs and aprons that had touched him were taken to the sick, and their illnesses were cured, and the evil spirits left them. That's pretty good. Like nobody's taking, my sweat rags and walking around with that sort of thing. This is an incredible thing. Like even if you're not a believer, this is an incredible claim. That God did extraordinary miracles, like so many that somebody's walking in and taking a handkerchief or an apron. Now, remember, Paul is a tent maker by trade, and he did this out in the heat all the time. So you have to imagine there's sweat rags laying all over the place. He's wearing an apron to get all the stuff done so he doesn't get his clothes dirty. What's probably happened is people are walking up to see him and walking up to talk to him, and they knew he had so much of God's power kind of working around him and through him. They didn't maybe know how, but they knew they were desperate. And they'd walk up and they'd just kind of grab one of those sweat rags and grab that apron, take it home to grandma. Take it home for that sick kid of theirs. Crazy stuff like that. I mean, that's incredible. And because that power was so evident, more and more people were saying, I'm following the same Jesus that Paul's talking about. I'm following that guy. Now, there was also a great kind of sorcery movement that went on in Ephesus. A great sorcery movement and a big temple that was dedicated to a goddess named Artemis. This worship of Artemis had existed long before Ephesus was even a city. It was just there in the region. But the Ephesians had built with their own money an incredible, grandiose structure that they called the Temple of Artemis. It had this giant colossus out front and everything. It was one of the wonders of the ancient world. And as part of that, there was this ancient sorcery movement that went on. So some of these sorcerers, they saw what Paul was able to do. They saw how Paul was able to cast out spirits. They saw how people were healed just with his sweat rags and stuff like that. They saw how amazing Paul was. And they realized that they didn't have anything like that in their arsenal. They realized that they had been made obsolete. They were now redundant. And so one of the cooler moments in Ephesian history is this one right here. A number who had practiced sorcery brought their scrolls together and burned them publicly. Here's why that's amazing. Because when they calculated the value of the scrolls, the total came to 50,000 drachmas. A drachma is equivalent to about 1 day's wages. That's 50,000 days of wages, or about 136 years. It's about 3 or 4 lifetimes in those days. That's a lot of money burning right there in front of everybody. You see, this does come down to money at some point. This does come down to money. This was what people treasured, and then suddenly they realized that this thing that they treasured was absolutely of no value any longer. And that's true for us, by the way. Whenever God is at the center of your life, whenever Jesus is directing your life and you're going through life, it's going to affect everything you do or don't do. It's going to affect your money. It's going to affect what you spend money on. It's going to affect where you give your money. It's going to affect what you think is valuable and important, what it is that you treasure. So you can imagine that when sorcerers are willing to come together and say, what we got is useless, and they do this publicly, that there is a big movement happening. In fact, there was such a movement that so many people were coming to faith. It was disrupting the worship of this goddess Artemis too. It was disrupting what was supposed to be happening in the temple. It was also disrupting the artisans and the silversmiths of the area who made all their little idols and who made these little trinkets that had pictures of the goddess Artemis in silver. Now you're messing with people's livelihood. Now you're messing with people's money. And so one of them was a guy named Demetrius. He's kind of the head of the crew here. He gets everybody together, all these artisans, all these silversmiths, all these people who have their financial well-being tied up in this temple of Artemis. And he says this to them: you know, my friends, that we receive a good income from this business. See, it's about money. You know we receive a good income from this business. He goes on, and you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus. So you see that Paul's doing this. He's leading them astray. And in practically the whole province of Asia, he's going all over the place being a troublemaker. He says that gods made by human hands are no gods at all. No gods at all. How can he say that? They're looking at him right in the face. So remember, these are the people who make the idols. These are the people who make the gods by hand. And Paul's going around saying, no, that's ridiculous. You're making that. That's nothing. That's ridiculous. And it's disrupting their income. It's messing with their income, their livelihood, and more importantly, their security. So Demetrius boils it down to an income thing. He gets that it's about money. He's appealing to them on that basis. But that's not where he leaves it. You can never just leave it at money. You got to couch it in something a little bit better than that. So he goes on. He says, there is danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited. Uh-oh. Now you're messing with people's religion. And the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty. See, this isn't just about religion either. It's not just about how everybody's supposed to love and worship this goddess. This is about culture, and this is about heritage now. It's about money, but we're also going to protect our money by appealing to the need to protect our culture and our heritage. He understands what button to push. See, when you feel like you have to protect your culture, when you feel like you have to protect your heritage, that's even further than having to protect your money. Because the Ephesians had rebuilt this temple with their own money, with no outside help from anybody. They had built this temple 400 years before Paul showed up. So that means somebody's father, and so on, helped to pay for that thing. I don't know if you know this, but sometimes churches can be that way too. My great-great-great-grandfather helped put that bell up in that tower up there, so we better ring it every time we can. We don't have a bell, but you know. Or my great-grandma put that green carpet in there in the kids' ministry. I know it smells like yesterday's bologna now, but I think we ought to keep it. That's how he's appealing to them. You watch politicians appeal this way a lot of times too. They appeal in this manner also because it divides. It divides like, hey, you need to protect this. You need to protect your culture. You need to protect your money. And they'll divide because if they can divide, then we can square off against each other and they can be the hero for one side. And all they got to do is win one side over rather than doing what's best for everybody. So, this guy is riling them up, talking about money, talking about culture, talking about heritage, how you got to protect all of that stuff. And as you might expect, the Ephesians who hear him are whipped into a fury. Here's what happens next. When they heard this, they were furious and began shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. And they kept shouting it, and they kept shouting it, and it became a mantra. And then they, in a weird scene, start going throughout all of Ephesus and grabbing people with them. And they're saying, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. And they're mad at the same time. Next thing you know, they're heading into the giant open space that is the public theater there. And they get in there. And what we hear from Scripture here in the book of Acts is that a lot of the people who were there didn't even know why they were there. That they were just like yelling, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. And they knew that somebody else there wanted them to be there. And they're screaming and they're yelling. On the way in, they grabbed a couple of Paul's fellow workers. And they said, get these guys in here. And they threw them in front of everybody. And they just kept shouting, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. This is what happens when you start messing with somebody's money, somebody's religion, somebody's culture and heritage. People get nonsensical. All rational and reasonable thought goes out the window. I had this guy when I was in college. I was in an ethics class. I went to a small Christian university, and I'd known this guy for about 3 or 4 years at this point, and we were in this Christian ethics class, and it was taught by a minister. He was a local pastor, but he had a PhD in ethics, and so he was perfectly suited to teach this class. And so in the class, he starts talking a little bit about pacifism, and he talks about how Jesus was self-sacrificial. Jesus laid down his life for others, and how the first Christians were also largely pacifists. They weren't fighting back. They willingly took what came at them as they were martyred for their faith. And he starts saying these things and intimating that maybe we should consider pacifism for that reason. And so from the back, a guy in my class I've known 3 or 4 years just starts shouting, my God is a warrior, my God's not a pushover. And you think one time was enough, but he keeps yelling it. My God is a warrior, my God's not a pushover. My God is a warrior. And finally the pastor professor guy goes, hey man, sounds like you have something to say. And so he did. He said, and he starts quoting all these Old Testament things, and the professor says, well, yeah, that's great. That's, from the Old Testament, and we're talking about that. That was a conquest of Canaan, but we're talking about Jesus and the first church and how they were self-sacrificial. And right back into it. My God is a warrior. My God is not a pushover. And just keeps going. It was so disruptive that the professor finally had to say, hey, just be quiet or get out. It's because it messed with this guy's worldview. It messed with his idea of who God had to be. It messed with his idea of who God just had to be so that his life and his world made sense. It's very similar to great as Artemis of the Ephesians. People who believe they're protecting their money, or more importantly, their heritage and culture, will do some crazy things. They can be whipped into a fury. They can be whipped into doing all sorts of things, even over silly stuff. I mean, what was Paul doing? What was Paul doing other than helping people? What were Paul and his companions doing other than helping people? People were being healed. Demonic presences were leaving. I'm sure that as the church grew, it wasn't just, hey, I got healed and now I'm just random Joe Schmo person. I'm sure they were also becoming good people as part of that, and they were loving each other. They were giving a great example of what faith in action looked like. I mean, that was the history of the churches that Paul started. That's what they were expected to do. I'm sure that Ephesus was a much lovelier place to live as a result of these Jesus followers springing up all over the place. I'm sure it was better than it had ever been. But they're mad. They're angry. They're upset. And now they're being manipulated into fighting over something they don't have to fight over. What I want you to see today, what I want you to understand, and what I want you to walk away with is this understanding. When God works through you, not everyone will like it. That is a sad truth. But it's one that I've found to be true over and over and over again, that when God works through you, not everyone will like it. They didn't like it when Jesus was here. They didn't like it when Paul was in Ephesus. And they're not going to like it when God begins to work through you. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to get out here and you're going to start raising people from the dead. I'm not saying that you're going to go around casting out demons or anything like that. But I am saying when God starts working and doing incredible things through you in your life, not everyone's going to like it. When you start living out the fruit of the Spirit, when you start exemplifying love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control, when those things become mainstays of your life and people see it, not everybody's going to like it. When you start talking to the other people around you about Jesus and about your faith in Jesus and why you have that faith in Jesus, not everyone is going to buy it, and they're not going to like it either. I don't know if you've ever heard the story of a guy named Bill Wilson. He's up in New York. He has a ministry called the Sidewalk Sunday School. He started it 50 years ago doing this. He has an incredible story if you've never looked him up. He started this ministry in a Brooklyn ghetto. And he goes around with a bus ministry, essentially, and he picks up kids for Sunday school. And he teaches them about Jesus. And it's grown and grown and grown. And it's not confined just to New York City anymore. It's gone throughout the world. There's different kind of campuses of this, if you will, around the world in big cities. So that over 200,000 people are affected every week because of this ministry. Bill Wilson's ministry has done a lot of really great things for a lot of people in New York City. But some of the things it did was it pulled away from recruitments to gangs and to drug dealers who were very angry about that. In the process, Bill has been stabbed, shot, pushed downstairs in a subway, and punched in the face while preaching. Not everybody's going to like it. Now, I realize that's a huge example. Right, that's a big example. But can I tell you that even for you in your life, when you start giving yourself fully over to Jesus and Jesus becomes like the thing you want to talk about, when Jesus becomes so central to your life that you want to share that with other people, not everybody's going to like that. Not everybody's going to understand it. And when you stop hanging around with the same people you always hung around with, when you stop telling the jokes that you used to always tell with those people, when you start going to those places and doing those things with all of those people, and you start going home and being with your family, when you quit participating in the gossip, and you start refusing to do that, and you maybe kind of quit hanging around with the people who love to gossip. When you start doing stuff like that, not everybody's going to like it, and not everybody's going to understand it. And I want you to know that's okay. Because God called you to something better. God called you to something bigger and greater than that. God called you out of that darkness and into the kingdom of God. Something that's better than anything we could ever possibly imagine. But you have to give yourself over fully to it. It's not easy. And it's not for everyone. Jesus kind of ends up anticipating this as he's talking. He tells his disciples, he warns them, like, not everybody's going to like you. They're going to come for you just like they came for me. And one day as he's preaching, he even says it like this. He says, enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. See, the broad way, the wide road, that's the ones with all the little gods and trinkets. That's the ones with all the idols. That's the one with all the gossip and all the hurtfulness. That's the one where we covet our money and our time and our treasure. That's the one where we covet all of that stuff for ourselves, and when we try to hoard all of those things, and we try to look good in front of everybody else, and we worry about what everybody else thinks of us. And we worry that not everybody likes that there's good, positive change happening in our life. But the narrow road says, no, there's one God. And he sent his son Jesus for me. The narrow road says, I'm following Jesus from here on out. Doesn't matter what you say, doesn't matter what she says, doesn't matter what my grandma says. I'm going forward and I'm following Jesus. I'm convinced, and that's what I'm doing. My hope for you, my prayer for you, is that you'll take the narrow road, the road less traveled, as it was. That you'll understand that there is this God who loves you and who loves all of humanity and has made a way for us to be reconciled, that you'll walk through that small gate. Would you do me a favor? Would you bow your head and close your eyes, just wherever you're at, even online, just for a moment. Let's take just a second. We just want to reflect. Maybe you're here today and you've been struggling a little bit with this idea of, like, how can I fully give myself to Jesus? All of my friends, or some of my friends, most of my people, they're not into that. If that's you, I want to challenge you to have courage in this moment. I want to challenge you to have courage in this moment to begin following Jesus in a way you never knew possible. I want to challenge you to have courage in this moment to say, I don't care about that stuff. I'm walking through the small gate. I'm going down the narrow road because that's the only way that leads to life. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand or walk up front or anything like that. I'll talk to you after service if you want to. But I want you in your heart right now, wherever you're at, make that commitment that you're following Jesus. And even if trouble comes, it'll be okay. Because just like God was there with Jesus, just like God was there with Paul, just like God was there with the disciples and all the early church, God will be there with you. What does it profit a man? What does it profit a woman if they gain the whole world and forfeit their soul? So God, I pray that you would give us courage today. Give us the courage to follow you with everything we have, because you are not a God created by human hands. You are a God who creates. You weren't created. You are the God who creates. We give ourselves over to you and say, have your way. Even if the whole world may think we're crazy, Lord, help us to stay strong.